Hey guys, welcome back. This week is Teacher Appreciation Week, and on Teacher Appreciation Week, I like to read one of my favorite books. This book is a little bit longer, so I will give you that warning. It's called Thank You, Mr. Falker, and the author is Patricia Polacco. Patricia Polacco has been to our school. She's visited Dillon Valley Elementary School, and she'll probably be coming back again. We had plans to see her this year. And this is a book about a little girl who was learning to read. And I don't know, I don't remember the whole process of learning to read myself, but I do remember the first word I ever read, and that was the word Ford. We were sitting in a car, and there was a Ford truck in front of us, and I remember sounding it out and reading, and just what an amazing feeling that is. So, this is called Thank You, Mr. Falker by Patricia Polacco. Thank you, Mr. Falker. The grandpa held the jar of honey so that the family could see, and then dipped a ladle into it and drizzled honey on the corner of a small book. The little girl had just turned 5. Stand up, little one, he cooed. I did this for your mother, your uncles, your older brother, and now you. And then he handed the book to her. Taste. She dipped her finger into the honey and she put it into her mouth. What is that taste? The grandma asked. The little girl answered, sweet. And then all of the family said in a single voice, yes, and so is knowledge. But knowledge is like the bee that made the honey sweet. You have to chase it through the pages of a book. The little girl knew that the promise to read was at last hers, and soon she was going to learn to read. Tricia, the littlest girl in the family, grew up loving books. Her school teacher mother read to her every night. Her red-headed brother brought his books home from school and shared them, and whenever she visited the family farm, her grandfather or grandmother read to her by a stone fireplace. When she turned 5, she went to kindergarten, and most of all, she hoped to read. Each day, she saw the kids in the first grade across the hall reading, and before the year was over, some of the kids in her own class began to read. Not Tricia. Still, she loved being at school because she could draw. The other kids would crowd around her and watch her do magic with crayons. In the first grade, you'll learn to read, her brother said. In the first grade, Tricia sat in a circle with the other kids. They were all holding Our Neighborhood, their first reader, sounding out the letters and the words. They said b, oi, boy, and ook, look. The teacher smiled at them, and when they all put the sounds together and got a word right. But when Tricia looked at the page, all she saw were wiggling shapes, and when she tried to sound out words, the other kids laughed at her. Tricia, what are you looking at in that book? They would say. I'm reading, she would say back to them. But her teacher would move on to the next person. Always, when it was her turn to read, her teacher had to help her with every single word. And while the other kids moved up into the second reader and the third reader, she stayed alone in Our Neighborhood. Tricia began to feel different. She began to feel dumb. The harder words got for the little girl, the more and the more time she spent drawing. Oh, how she loved to draw, or just sitting and dreaming, or when she could, going for walks with her grandmother. One summer day, she and her grandma were walking together in the small woods behind their farm. It was twilight. The air was sweet and warm. Fireflies were just coming up from the grasses. As they walked, Tricia said, Grandma, do you think I'm different? Of course, her grandma answered. To be different is the miracle of life. You see all of those little fireflies? Every one of them is different. Do you think I'm smart? Tricia didn't feel smart. Her grandma hugged her. You are the smartest, quickest, dearest little thing ever. And right then the little girl felt safe in her grandma's arms. Reading didn't matter so much. Tricia's grandma used to say that the stars were holes in the sky. They were the light of heaven coming from the other side. And she used to say that someday she would be on the other side where the light comes from. Then one evening they lay in the grass together and they counted all of the lights from heaven. You know, her grandma said, all of us will go there someday. Hang on to the grass or you will lift right off of the ground, and there you'll be." They laughed and they both hung on to the grass. But it was not long after that night that her grandma must have let go of the grass, because she went to where the lights were on the other side, and not long after that Trisha's grandpa let go of the grass too. School seemed harder and harder now. Reading was just plain torture. When Sue Ellen read her page or Tommy Bob read his page, they read so easily that Trisha would watch the top of their heads to see if something was happening to their heads that wasn't happening to hers. And numbers were the hardest thing of all to read. She never added anything right. "Line up the numbers before you add them," their teacher would say. But when Trisha tried, the numbers looked like a stack of blocks, wobbly and ready to fall. She just knew she was dumb. And then one day her mother announced that she had gotten a teaching job in California, a long way from the family farm in Michigan. Even though her grandma and grandpa were gone now, the little girl didn't want to move. Maybe, though, the teachers in her new school wouldn't know how dumb she was. She and her mother and her brother moved across the country in a two-tone 1949 Plymouth. It took 5 days. But at the new school, it was just the same. When she tried to read, she stumbled over the words. The cat ran. She was reading like a little baby, and she was in the 3rd grade. And when her teacher read along with them and called on Trisha for an answer, she gave the wrong answer every time. "Hey, dummy," a boy called out to her on the playground. "How come you are so dumb?" Other kids stood near him, and they laughed. Trisha could feel the tears burning in her eyes, how she longed to go back to her grandparents' farm in Michigan. Now Trisha wanted to go to school less and less. "I have a sore throat," she would say to her mother, or "I have a stomach ache." She dreamed more and more, and she drew more and more, and she hated school. And then when Trisha started the 5th grade, the school was all abuzz. There was a new teacher. He was tall and elegant. Everybody loved his striped coat and his slick gray pants. He wore the neatest clothes. All the usual teachers' pets gathered around him, Stevie Joe and Alice Marie and Davy and Michael Lee. But right from the start, it didn't seem to matter to Mr. Falker which kids were the cutest or the smartest or the best at anything. Mr. Falker would stand behind Trisha whenever she was drawing, and he would whisper, "This is brilliant, absolutely brilliant. Do you know how talented you are?" And when he said this, even the kids who teased her would turn around in their seats and they would look at her drawings, but they still laughed whenever she gave a wrong answer. And then one day, she had to stand up and read, which she hated. She was stumbling through a page in Charlotte's Web, and the page was going all fuzzy when the kids began to laugh out loud. Mr. Falker, in his plaid jacket and his butterfly tie, said, "Stop. Are all of you so perfect that you can look at another person and find fault with her?" That was the last day anyone laughed out loud or made fun of her, all except Eric. He had sat behind Trisha for 2 whole years, but he seemed almost to hate her. Trisha didn't even know why. He waited by the door of the classroom for her, and he pulled her hair. He waited for her on the playground, and he leaned in her face, and he called her Toad. Trisha was afraid to turn any corner for fear that Eric would be there. She felt completely alone. The only time she was really happy was when she was around Mr. Falker. He let her erase the blackboards. Only the best students got to do that. He patted her on the back whenever she got something right, and he looked hard and mean at any kid who teased her. But the nicer Mr. Falker was to Trisha, the worse Eric treated her. He got all the other kids to wait for her on the playground or in the cafeteria or even in the bathroom, and to jump out and call her stupid or ugly. And Trisha began to believe them. She discovered that if she asked to go to the bathroom just before recess, she could go hide under the inside stairwell during the free time and not have to go outside at all in that dark place. She felt completely safe. But then one day at recess, Eric followed her to her secret hiding place. "Have you become a mole?" he laughed, and he pulled her out into the hall and he danced around her. "Dumbbell, dumbbell, maggoty old dumbbell." Trisha buried her head in her arms and she curled up into a little ball, and suddenly she heard footsteps. It was Mr. Falker. He marched Eric down to the office, and when he came back, he found Trisha. "I don't think you'll have to worry about that boy again," he said softly. "What was he teasing you about, little one?" "I don't know," Trisha shrugged. Trisha was sure that Mr. Falker believed that she could read. She had learned to memorize what the kid next to her was reading, or she would wait for Mr. Falker to help her with a sentence, and then she'd say the same thing that he did. "Good," he would say. And then one day Mr. Falker asked her to stay after school, and he helped to wash the blackboards. He put on music and he brought out little sandwiches as they worked and they talked, and all at once he said, "Let's play a game. I'll shout out letters and you write them on the blackboard with a wet sponge as quickly as you can." "A," he shouted. She wiped a watery A. "8," he shouted. She made a watery 8. 14, 3, D, M, Q, he shouted. He shouted out many, many letters and numbers, and then he walked up behind her, and together they looked at the board. It was a watery mess. Trisha knew that none of the letters or the numbers looked like they should. She threw the sponge down, and she tried to run. But Mr. Falker caught her arm, and he sank to his knees in front of her. "You poor baby," he said. "You think you're dumb, don't you? How awful for you to be so lonely and afraid." She sobbed. "But little one, don't you understand? You don't see letters or numbers the way that other people do, and you've gotten through school all of this time, and you have fooled many, many good teachers." He smiled at her. "That took cunning and smartness and such bravery." And then he stood up and he finished washing the board. "We're going to change all of that, girl. You're going to read. I promise you that." Now, almost every day after school, she met with Mr. Falker and Miss Plessy, a reading teacher. They did a lot of things that she didn't even understand. At first, she made circles in the sand and then big sponge circles on the blackboard, going from left to right, left to right. Another day, they flicked letters on a screen, and Trisha shouted them out loud. Still other days, she worked with wooden blocks, and she built words. Letters, 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 words, 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 always sounding them out, and that felt good. But though she would read the words, she hadn't read a whole sentence, and deep down, she still felt dumb. And then one spring day, had it been 3 months or 4 months since they had started, Mr. Falker put a book in front of her. She had never seen it before. He picked a paragraph in the middle of the page and he pointed at it, almost as if it were magic or as if light just poured into her brain. The words and the sentences started to take shape on the page as they never had before. She marched them off to... Slowly, she read a sentence and then another, and finally she had read a whole paragraph, and she understood the whole thing. She didn't notice that Mr. Falker and Miss Plessy had tears in their eyes. That night, Trisha ran home without stopping to catch her breath. She bounded up the front steps. She threw open her front door and she ran through the dining room to the kitchen. She climbed up on the cupboard and she grabbed a jar of honey. And then she went into the living room and she found the book on the shelf. The very book that her grandpa had shown her so many years ago. She spooned honey onto the cover and she tasted the sweetness and she said to herself, "The honey is sweet, and so is knowledge, but knowledge is like the bee who made the honey. It has to be chased through the pages of the book." And then she held the book, honey and all, close to her chest. She could feel tears roll down her cheeks, but they weren't tears of sadness. She was happy. So very happy. The rest of the year became an odyssey of discovery and adventure for the little girl. She learned to love school. I know, because that little girl was me, Patricia Polacco. I saw Mr. Falker again some 30 years later at a wedding, and I walked up to him and I introduced myself, and at first he had difficulty placing me, and then I told him who I was and how he had changed my life so many years ago. He hugged me and he asked me what I did for a living. Why, Mr. Falker, I answered. I make books for children. Thank you, Mr. Falker. Thank you. So this is a beautiful story, and just in honor of Teacher Appreciation Week, I wanted to read that for you. Have a good afternoon.